Welcome to Learning Photoshop for Beginners. This is the third class on beginning Photoshop. So if you've missed the first two, I'll leave a link up here and you can go into the description and you can go to those videos and catch up. Hi, I'm Terry Vanderheiden, professional photographer, and I use Photoshop just about every day. So in this episode, we're going to learn about even more tools in Photoshop. Now, understanding what each of these tools do is an important part of learning Photoshop. So let's continue on. In the last episode, we ended with the erase tool. So let's see what's next. Now I'm inside of Lightroom here, and I like to always go out into Lightroom, right click, and then edit in Photoshop. And the reason I like to do that is because I'm able to, whatever changes I make, that file, that Photoshop file, goes back into Lightroom and I can access it again and do more work on it. So I don't have to go find it, which is really helpful. All right, so we've got an image up here, and you can see what I did is I made a additional layer here. I just made a quick selection of this, and I'll show you about selecting here when we get to it. But I just wanted to show you why we're going to need this next tool coming up shortly. And here's this bird. I copied it from here and just made a selection around it, and now we're just setting it over here on the wire. So on these tools, as we go over here, we ended with the erase tool. The next tool down is the gradient tool. And the gradient tool is really useful, but not until we start getting into masks and things like that. So we're not going to use the gradient tool quite yet. But quite simply, when you use the gradient tool, we'll make a new layer over here. Plus sign, make a new layer. When we go in the gradient tool, we have a couple of different options. We have classic gradient, regular gradient. We've got an option to tell Photoshop how we want this gradient to go. And in this case, we're using our default colors, so black to white. Or you can just get rid of the white and have it go from black to nothing, and then or you can do it reverse. And up here are some different looks of the gradient. So this gradient, for instance, is just going to be, you click and drag, and you can see that it makes a gradient across. You have the ability with this little box here to change where the transition is, if you'd like less of a transition or more of a transition. Obviously here you can move the gradient, start it wherever you want. Let's say you want to start it here and move it over here and make it fade across. This is typical black to white. So let's undo that. And we'll do another gradient here. This time we're going to put it into black to transparent. So you can see that we can darken in and it works on the same gradient. We'll still have the ability to change how this transitions, change how and what position this goes in. And this gives us the opportunity to create a gradient. So you can use it for burning and dodging, but I'll show you a little later in the classes of how you really use the gradient tool. It works fantastic. And we're going to just make a radiant gradient and watch what happens. We can just pull it out and you can see that you have the ability to make a radiant gradient so it goes from black and fades out to nothing. There's also, let's undo it. In undoing it, I'm just using Command Z, or if you're on a PC, it'd be Control Z. That's a real simple way to undo what you just did. So they have different gradients that will do different looks for you. And depending on what you're working with, you might find that that gradient works better. But for the sake of just beginning learning it, this is the gradient tool, and this is essentially the controls. But I will show you later on how it actually works and where we need it in many shots. The next tool down starts with the smudge tool, the blur tool, and the sharpen tool. So let's say we'll default to the blur tool. Now what the blur tool does is it blurs pixels. So from a real simple standpoint, if we want to come over here to a close-up of this, and you can see down here that that little box is an area that shows what we're actually seeing on the screen. So it's pretty convenient when you're zooming around and trying to get to where you want to be. So if we wanted to take this blur tool, we can just go over, let's make a copy of this so we're not ruining the original one. And you're never ruining it until you save it, but the reality is I always like to work in layers because that allows me lots of freedom. So let's take this and we take our blur tool, and again, you've got the ability to, there's different modes that you can work in, which we'll go over modes later. But strength of it. So if you want 100%, or if you'd like to slide it down to 30 or whatever percent, we'll leave it at 100 for today. Sample all layers, meaning that we're going to work on this one, but we're going to sample the rest of the layers. And so I encourage you, most all of your defaults should be sample all layers. There'll be times where you won't need it, but for the most part, that's something you're going to want to have. So we can see with the blur tool, what we're going to do is we're just going to start painting. And as we paint, the more times we paint over and over and over and over, then this image becomes more blur. So it could help you when you're blurring, say, a background or something like that. But where it really comes into play is when you're doing composites. So that's what reason I duplicated this hawk up here. Let's go back so we can see them both. I just made a quick selection of this and put them over here on this wire. It's not, doesn't look quite right yet, but that's okay. So we're gonna get up here, and then we're gonna zoom in a little bit more. And one of the things you find when you're working in composites is that sometimes your selection is a little too straight. And in fact, in this case, we selected also, just from the quick selection, we selected his shadows as well as his talons. So not something we really want. But you can see here, this really doesn't match. It's a little too gritty. So the way you use the blur tool is you come up here, maybe make the strength about, I don't know, 50%, something like that. Now you have the ability to just kind of go along, and we'll zoom this up even a little bit more. And you have the ability to take the blur tool and just go along an edge of something that you've cut in, and it makes it look a little more realistic. Instead of that sharp cut that you would get with a selection, you can make it dissolve into the image below a little bit by adding some blur. And so that is how you normally use the blur tool while you're working in Photoshop, because it's a really great tool. You're going to use it all the time when you're doing composites, and that's allowing you to come in and just kind of blur the edges of something to make it look a little bit more realistic than it really needs to be where it is. So the sharpen tool is the next one in line, and that obviously works just the opposite. You can take on a brush tip and sharpen areas of your image if you just want to start painting in there. Right now we have the strength of 51%, and we'll sharpen the beak. Now this is not the best way to sharpen. I'll show you the best ways to sharpen as we get into this deeper, but for this discussion, this is how you use the sharpen tool. Where the blur tool is a lot more useful because you're going to be using it to kind of blend in images in composites, where the sharpen tool, there's better ways to sharpen, but it does allow you to do that. So we'll turn that off and on. You can see, and that's sharpened. That's the way it was originally, and that's sharpened. So you have the ability to go ahead and sharpen on a different layer if you want, which is kind of cool, and you have it on a brush tip. But again, I'm going to show you some tricks that I think you're going to like even better. So let's zoom this out. Also nested in this toolbox is, with blur and sharpen, it's a smudge tool. Now what the smudge tool does is it moves pixels. So watch this. If we wanted to take this little tuft and move it, we can just start moving it in, make his neck a little bit thinner. Now there might be some better ways to do this in Photoshop, of which I'm going to show you later, but for right now this just shows you what you can do, similarly what you can do with the smudge tool. And obviously if you wanted to enlarge something, you could start pushing those pixels out and making things however you want to make them. But it's obviously you can get into a little trouble working with this tool. So, but that's the smudge tool. Go from there to there, depending on what it is you're trying to do. And the next tool down is a really great set of tools. This is the dodging and burning and sponge tool. And I want you to remember this, that to get to this tool, you just tap the letter O. That's a shortcut. We'll go over shortcuts in another lesson, but you're going to want to use the dodge tool and the burn tool quite a bit in Photoshop. So it enables you to really fix things up the way you want them to look. So let's go ahead and make a new layer here. Again, dragging the main layer down onto that plus sign. And we'll zoom this up a little bit more. And now we're going to go into our dodge tool. So our dodge tool has the ability to dodge and lighten, essentially, any part of the image that we want. Again, we're on a little brush here. You can see the brush tip. We can make it larger or smaller with our bracket keys. And you have three choices: shadows, highlights, and midtones. So let's just start with highlights. And anything that's a highlight is going to get lightened to the tune of 19%, because that's what we have this set on. You can obviously do it all the way at 100%. I don't recommend it. Usually I'm working in about 17 to 19%, somewhere around in there is what I generally am working in. Because every time you go over the same image with that same brush, it enhances it even more. So you don't really need to start at 100%. You can just work your way into it. So let's say we want to brighten this up a little bit. We can just start brightening the areas. We can start brightening. And as you see here, when I painted on the front of his chest, it really just brightened up the light tones. It's not messing with the dark tones. It's only brightening up the light tones because we have it set on highlights. So if we go to shadows, which is just the opposite, we can start lightening up shadows. This is just going to work with the ones that are considered shadows in this image. So let's show you what that looks like off and on. And you can see that we can lighten and darken that way. And of course, you can also do midtones as well. And this is probably what you're going to do most of the time, is you're just in there trying to dodge and lighten some midtones to bring out some detail. And that's a pretty common use of the dodging and burning tool. The burning tool is obviously just the opposite. We'll go to burn. And again, you have three options: highlight, shadows, midtones. So if you go to shadows and we want to burn shadows, that means we're going to darken them. So we can come in here and paint in, and it's just going to darken just the shadow pixels inside of this bird. So we're able to darken and create a little bit more. So when we go across here, it doesn't do anything to the iris because that's all considered a highlight, but it does darken the blacks around it and darkens down in here. You can come in here. You can also do midtones and highlights. You got to be a little cautious with highlights because it can kind of make them look a little gray. So let's see how this looks here. You can start darkening things here, but if it's a pure white to begin with, darkening it isn't going to look that great. It's going to look, see, it looks a little dingy there. So be a little careful with your highlights when you're burning them. But midtones and shadows is where you're going to use this a lot. You're going to darken areas and you're going to create contrast, and it's a great way to paint in contrast to really bring make your image a lot more detailed, and it really doesn't take much time. You can just come in here and start dodging and burning and create a beautiful image. So let's turn this off. That's what it was before, and that's what it was after our dodging and burning. So the next tool that's nested in here is the sponge tool. And the sponge tool is just that. You can either desaturate, come up here to the options bar, desaturate or saturate. So saturate, we're going to leave this at 100% so you can see it. But again, you want to be a little cautious with this sort of thing. So let's go ahead and saturate the colors of this bird. So we can saturate just the bird. We're not saturating the background in this case. We're just saturating the bird. And we'll saturate the eye as well. And we'll saturate this green on his. So you can go in and saturate things however you want in an image on the tip of a brush. And again, you probably would never use this at 100%, but you might use it at 19 or 20% and just start trying to saturate this. And you're going to bring out a little more yellow in the talons as we go. You can see the difference as it's starting to build. Just a little 19, 20% at a time. And you're just saturating the areas that you want to saturate. So we'll turn that off and then on again. And you can see what we've done with saturating on the tip of a brush. Really super handy tool. So the opposite of that is the desaturate. So if we want to desaturate something, let's go ahead and make a new layer. Bring that up to the top of our layer stack. And now we're starting from scratch again. Now desaturate will do just the opposite. It will take away color. It'll just start, if you do it enough, you're going to turn this into a black and white image. So let's go ahead and hit the flow to 100% so things go a little bit faster. And again, you're just taking out all the color in this particular image, and you're going to be able to make this completely a grayscale image when you're done. Or if you want a part to be not grayscale, like you want full color, like say on the eye, for instance, and then you can just paint in whatever you want. So this gives you the ability to desaturate on the tip of a brush, where the sponge can either saturate or desaturate, add more color or take color away. So it's just for color and saturating or desaturating with the color. If you're enjoying these free classes on learning Photoshop from the beginning, do me a favor, hit the like button and then click on subscribe, and then remember to ring the little bell icon to be reminded of my next video. Also, if you have questions or comments on something that I have already covered in the class, then feel free to leave it in the comments below. I read every single one. If you'd rather contact me directly, you're welcome to do that. You can send me an email to terry@imagelight.com. All right, we brought up another image here. The next tool down is the pen tool, and the pen tool is a great tool for selecting. There's a lot to it. I'll probably have a whole episode just on the pen tool as we go, because it is the primary tool for selecting perfect selections. And we'll get to that at another date. The next one down is the text tool. So if you wanted to write text on here, you could do that. And obviously you have all the controls up here of your fonts, of whatever font it is that you'd like, the size of the text. And if you wanted to do text, now this is obviously useful if you're making greeting cards or something along those lines, or posters for people. But as photographers, we're not typically putting text on our images, so it's probably not something we're going to need a lot of use for. But let's go ahead and get rid of that. And the next section down is the selection tool. So this is black or white. They do two different things, and they are directly connected to the pen tool. I don't understand why Photoshop put the text tool between them, but let's just face it, this is actually only mainly used with the pen tool. The next tool down is a shape tool. So if you wanted to put in a shape, it would fill that shape. If you wanted to fill it with a color, we'll just add a color, and then you can just have a shape if you're working with shapes. Now again, this is probably not as aligned with photographers, but more so with artists and designers. They can use this tool to create whatever it is kind of shape that they need to use. We can use it. There is a use for it that I will show you a little later, and that's doing a custom shape and creating something with a custom shape. It's kind of cool. All right, so let's get rid of that. The next section down is the hand tool. So the hand tool allows you to move the image around. So you can just click on the hand and move it around over here. But in the very first episode, I showed you that we use the space bar, and that turns any tool into the hand tool. So we're on the sponge tool, for instance, and you press the space bar and it turns into a hand and you can move it. So I can't say I ever come over here and click the hand tool, because the hand tool is just so accessible by using the space bar. The next section down in tools is the magnifying glass, and this is our zoom tool. And as we zoom, you'll see you get on the magnifying glass, and if we click, you'll see that our box gets a little smaller because it's zooming in on whatever it is that we're telling it to zoom into. So when you click, it goes in increments. So let's go on back to where we started, and right now you can see it's at 429%. As we click, it goes up to 5, click again, 6.5. It'll be increments, 25%, 33%, 50%, on up, on however you want to do it. You can also zoom. We already know you can zoom down here. You can do them with the little slider if you want. You also have your options up here for the zoom tool. So for instance, if you have scrubby zoom clicked on here, watch what happens when you go to zoom. As you hold down your click, it'll zoom up. The opposite of this is holding the Option key for the Mac or the Alt key for the PC, and then you can zoom out if you want. But I don't really care for the scrubby zoom, so I usually take that off. But you can easily use these. Let's say you want to fit the screen with your image. That's a real quick way to do that. Fill the screen with the image. You'll see here, it filled the whole screen with it. So occasionally you may want to find that you want to do that. See, we're just moving palettes out of the way so we can get to everything. But I leave this off, and the way I use the zoom tool is like this. I will click on the zoom tool. Now the other shortcut to the zoom tool is the letter Z. So if you're on some other tool, let's say you're on the clone tool, and if you hit the Z key, it'll turn into that little magnifying glass and allow you to zoom. So what I do with this generally for zooming is I don't really use the navigator. Occasionally I do, but I don't use the navigator a lot. For most of my zooming, I'm just going to come up here, draw a box around what I want to zoom into, and then it zooms up to that level so I can see everything that's in that box. Now, a lot of times I'll go back here and make it a little bit smaller so I can see what I want to do. Let's say I wanted to check out his foot. I can zoom in and just look at the foot area. So this is how I typically use the zoom tool, is I'm going to zoom into whatever it is that I want to work on and draw, basically click and then drag a little box around whatever it is that I want to zoom, and then I can zoom up to it. It's a real simple way to go. Now the opposite goes where if you hold the Option key down, you're going to click. Every time you click, it'll go back a stage. So you can zoom out that way. So the zooming is going to be click or Option or Alt click will go back out to where you want. You can also zoom down here on the navigator, but generally what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the zoom tool and I'm going to kind of just draw a line around whatever it is that I want to zoom and then let it go. And that's where I'm working in close if I want to do that. So that's the zoom tool. The next section down of tools that I want to make sure you have some knowledge on are these colors. And this is typical of our colors. So right now our default is black and white. And when you click on one of these, it'll bring up this color bar. So it starts at red, and you can come down and click around and find a color that you like. And then you come over here and can click on it. And then when you say OK, that color is now installed as your main color. You can flip these by clicking this little double arrow, or you can hit the X key. The X key will flip those two colors. That's a shortcut. Flip between the two colors. And the D key will bring you back to the default colors, which is black and white. So that's a simple way to get the colors, and we'll get into colors later, but for right now, that's what we're going to work in. This is a kind of a masking tool, which we're not going to deal with right yet, but those are generally the tools that we work on. And remember, when you're working in tools, just about every tool you have has some options up here. If you want to more control over your tools, these options are where you're going to find it. Every tool just about has more options up here when you're working in them. Chance to practice last week? I hope so. If not, take a moment to do a little bit of practice learning the things that we've learned today. Work with these additional tools and just try moving around to get comfortable with it. So and it isn't going to hurt you to learn some of the shortcuts. And as you know, the shortcuts are pretty easy to find. You click on this little arrow and usually there's a letter next to them. If it has a shortcut, it's going to have a nice little letter right next to it. And that just means typing that letter on your keyboard will get you to that tool, whichever it is. You can just zip around using your shortcuts, and that'll give you an opportunity to get right in there and work with those tools. So this is everything about the tools so far, and we're going to get into some new things next time. Thanks for watching.